Alright, so we're picking up with Kennedy's New Frontier. You can see Kennedy here in the Oval Office, and you should recognize this gentleman right here, Martin Luther King Jr. He's meeting with some of the civil rights leaders of the NAACP and CORE. And LBJ, the gentleman back here, he obviously becomes the President of the United States once JFK gets assassinated. While Kennedy did not have a strong civil rights record while in the Senate, he did portray himself as a crusader for the African American rights during his campaign. Toward the end of his presidency, he abandoned his cautious approach. In a special report to the American people on civil rights, he talked about the racial inequality that had long endured in the nation. It ought to be possible for American students of any color to attend any public institution. It ought to be possible for any consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, and it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and vote in free election. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it, and we cherish it here at home, but are we to say to the world, and much more importantly to each other, that this is the land of the free, except for the Negroes? So Kennedy's determination to change life at home, especially for African Americans, and his domestic agenda will become known as the New Frontier. That's the basis for his plan as President of the United States. And as JFK showed in his 1960 campaign and in his inaugural address, he had a special quality or charisma about him that separated him from other politicians. He was one that was willing to stand up for something that was right, even though it wasn't popular. President Kennedy is unlike most presidents in the past. He was young. He was what most would consider good-looking. He had young children in the White House, something that hadn't been done in decades. And there was just kind of this charm about the Kennedy family. Kennedy grew up having a series of ailments as a young child, and he took numerous drugs ever since his childhood to kind of combat with a lot of issues that he had, a lot of back pain and neck pain and leg pain, and he had a variety of different illnesses that he was battling even as President of the United States. So Kennedy was troubled by the high levels of poverty in our country, and as I said, his policy becomes known as the New Frontier. And in this, he pledged to create economic opportunity and expand health care and civil rights for everyone. And he also wanted to jumpstart the space program, to devote more money to the space program. Through his New Frontier, he will increase the minimum wage. He will extend Social Security benefits. He will improve the welfare system and pass the Equal Pay Act, which will create fair wages for men and women across the board. The idea was equal work, equal pay, regardless of sex. In his speech about the New Frontier, he says, "I stand tonight facing west on what was once the last frontier," referring to the western part of the United States. "From the lands that stretch 3,000 miles behind me, the pioneers of old gave up their safety, their comforts, and sometimes their lives to build a new world here in the West. But the problems are not solved, and the battles are not all won, and we stand together on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats." And he gives that speech on July 15th, 1960, kind of laying out what his purpose is going to be for the New Frontier. So as we said, one of his deals is try to kind of jumpstart the space program. We feel as though we're losing this race with the Russians. In 1961, the Soviets sent the first man to orbit the moon. His name was Yuri Gagarin. Kennedy recognized that we as the United States need to be beating the Soviet Union in what was called the space race. So he made it a national goal to place a man on the moon before 1970, and he gave billions and billions of dollars to NASA to make that happen. And John Glenn will become the first American to orbit the Earth in 1962. And then in May of 1961, NASA sends Alan Shepard into a suborbital space mission on the Mercury 2. And Kennedy will succeed in his mission to put somebody on the moon by 1970. Unfortunately, he's not alive to see it happen, but that will be Neil Armstrong on the Columbia spacecraft in July of 1969, putting a flag on the moon. Now, there are theories about how this is staged and it's not real and blah, 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 blah. But as an American, I'm going to go ahead and believe that it did occur and Neil Armstrong did walk on the moon. And this is when you get the famous saying of one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. So as we know already, Kennedy does pass away in November of 1963 while in Dallas, Texas. It was an unimaginable horror to watch the president get assassinated on TV, going to Texas to kind of mend the differences between him and the South, and to try to promote the Civil Rights Bill. Lee Harvey Oswald will be the assassinator. This is not in red at all because we already kind of got some of the basis for that in the previous section. After Kennedy's death, Vice President Johnson will be sworn in as the new president. This is an image of him being sworn in on Air Force One. And the nation will be moved to resolve the economic and equality issues that Kennedy had identified. And Johnson will stick true to what Kennedy was attempting to achieve during his presidency. And first, Johnson wants to try to figure out why Kennedy was assassinated. So they put together the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. There were questions of whether Oswald had worked alone, whether he was assisted or associated with the Russians, if there was anybody within the federal government that was associated with the assassination of Kennedy, etc. And the committee determines that Oswald was a lone wolf, that no one assisted him, there was no one in the federal government that was part of the plan, and there was no evidence to support the fact that Oswald was working or associated with the Russians. So here is the Time magazine headline. Shortly after President Johnson wins his re-election, or wins election in 1964, he finished out obviously in 1963, and he is a gentleman that was born in Stonewall, Texas, which has a current population of 469, so that tells you how small the area is where he grew up. He attended Southwest Texas State College in San Marcos, Texas. Then he taught in Cotulla, Texas, in a segregated school of Mexican Americans not far from the border with Mexico. And there he sees poverty firsthand. And it kind of sets a stage for him wanting to devote his life to public service. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress. In the speech, he talked about some of his hopes for America and how he wished to be remembered by history. He explained, "I do not want to be the president who built empires, or sought grandeur, or extended dominion. I want to be the president who educated young children, who helped to feed the hungry, and who helped the poor to find their own way." So he became a teacher, obviously. He taught for several years, and then he gets into politics. And in 1937, he was elected to Congress. And this is how he continues his devotion to the public, going from being teacher to public servant as a politician. And after Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in, he worked to try to continue, as I said, those same goals that Kennedy was fighting for. These goals will eventually lead to Johnson's Great Society. That was the name of his plan, like Kennedy's was the New Frontier, in which he thought that every American should achieve a good quality of life. And the first victory there was going to be the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in black because we put it in our notes. And Johnson realized that he was an important piece of Kennedy's victory with the South and the Mexican Americans, and he kind of wanted to run with that. He wanted to use that to his advantage to try to convince Congress to make adjustments in the way that civil rights was done and the way that poor people were treated. President Johnson will convince Congress to pass big tax cuts for the middle class, and he established what was called the War on Poverty. Johnson made his intentions clear in his first State of the Union address when he said that it was time to declare an unconditional war on poverty. The fact that we had poor people across the nation that couldn't even provide themselves with food or a roof over their head disgusted LBJ just like it disgusted JFK when we were considered the richest country in the world, but we had such a a mass amount of poor people in our own country. So the War on Poverty will spend roughly $1 billion in its very first year of existence. And today, 2017, we spend about $1 trillion a year on programs for those that are below the poverty line. And as part of the War on Poverty in 1964, food stamps are also introduced to aid in those that make money below the poverty line. Continuing with the War on Poverty, you have the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which will create the Job Corps, which is training young people in work skills. This still trains about 70,000 people today. This is where a lot of your trade schools come in, like your tech schools, and it's mainly targeting 16 to 21-year-olds, so high school and a little bit beyond that. The Economic Opportunity Act will also establish VISTA, which stands for Volunteers in Service to America, and that will send volunteers into poorer American communities. It sends volunteers into poverty-stricken neighborhoods. They served in inner-city schools and on Indian reservations, areas that typically had a high rate of poverty. And then another extremely important piece to this, and definitely is one that we're still being impacted by today, it was called Project Head Start, which funded preschool programs for those that were below the poverty line. Funds were provided for playgroups, daycares, activities. They're designed to help underprivileged children get ready for elementary school. And it actually started out as a 6-week summer program, and now, here in 2017, it's something that people go to all year round. I benefited from the Head Start program, as we've talked about before. I did grow up, and I guess you could consider it poverty. I was below the poverty line, and so I got that Head Start by going to those programs to kind of get ahead of the game because of the financial situation that my family was in. So in the 1964 presidential election, Johnson, who obviously is already the president thanks to the assassination of JFK, he will defeat Barry Goldwater, who was an Arizona senator who was completely anti-Johnson, wanted nothing to do with the policies that Andrew Johnson was preaching in 1963, and believed that the government was actually the problem and the root of a lot of people's issues, and not actually the answer, not the one that was there to solve the problems that people were dealing with. So Johnson does win, and he uses this popularity to push through his policies that were known as the Great Society, that he believed would end poverty and racial injustice and provide that opportunity for every child that he believed they deserved. Some of the major pieces of Johnson's Great Society is it does create Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare and Medicaid are both ones that we have today. Medicare targets elderly people, so that's 65 and over. Medicaid targeted poor and disabled people. He also provided funds for impoverished school districts with the passing of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which improved schools, built libraries, built learning centers, language laboratories, and other services to try to provide help and assistance for those that were less fortunate. He passed legislation to improve air and water quality. A great book that kind of opens the eyes of LBJ is written by Rachel Carson. It's called Silent Spring, and it deals with the environmental concerns and issues of not taking care of what Earth has provided us. And so in 1965, LBJ will get the Water Quality Act passed, and then the Clean Water Restoration Act passed in 1966, both trying to take care of the water resources that we have here in our country. He'll also pass the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which will lift the immigration quotas that were established way back when, that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and there will be a flood of immigrants coming into our country thanks to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And then the last major thing that the Great Society will achieve is the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, trying to improve the different venues of education that students are exposed to, especially dealing with the arts and humanities programs at the educational level. That will be all for this particular section, so make sure you guys get this taken care of and prepare yourself for the quiz on Monday.